And we'll do that now. I'm going to talk about probably my favorite organ, your heart. Okay, describing a heart, we can basically just call it a muscle. It is the main muscle responsible for pumping deoxygenated blood to our lungs, as well as oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. It must be constantly to circulate our body, or excuse me, our blood through our body and through our blood vessels so that it can reach our body cells and exchange materials with them. Some pretty wild statistics here. The heart, to accomplish this, must beat about 100,000 times a day, adding up to about 35 million beats per year, and over a lifetime, that's about 2.5 billion beats. Obviously, significant number, and demonstrates why your heart's so amazing and why I find it to be the most amazing organ that we have. Although the brain's amazing too. I don't know. I just have affinity for the heart. If you want to kind of visualize the size of your heart, make a closed fist. That's about the size of it. It's about 12 centimeters or 5 inches in length, 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches wide at its broadest point, and about 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches thick. Weighs about 8 ounces in females and a little bigger, 10 ounces in males. Location is in the mediastinum, which we previously have introduced this term before. It's an anatomical region extending from the sternum to the vertebral column, from the first rib to the diaphragm, and in between the lungs. Okay, about 2/3 of the heart's mass lies to the left of our body's midline. Okay, here is a nice illustration of that. We've got dotted line here down the center of the body, what we call the midline. Okay, about 2/3 of your heart is over on that side. Okay, and I really like this image to really demonstrate that location. Okay, that explains why when you put your hand over your heart to do like the Star Spangled Banner or the Pledge of Allegiance as a kid, you are supposed to put it on kind of the left side of your chest, not right down the middle or on the right side. Okay, now I talked about the very beginning of the semester, the fact that our heart is kind of like an inverted triangle. So in other words, it's an upside down triangle, but not pointing directly down is the point of the heart, which is what we call the apex. It's formed by the left ventricle and it rests on your diaphragm like so, but it kind of points more towards your left hip. Okay, so if you want to visualize the kind of way that our heart sits, draw a line from your right shoulder down to your left hip, and that's kind of the way that the heart angles. Okay, so that's what we call the apex of the heart. The base of your heart is the widest part, formed by the atria, which are the two upper chambers. Okay, mostly it's the left atrium forming the base. Okay, but as you can see, it describes the base as being the posterior surface. Okay, and that's because your heart not only is cockeyed from your right shoulder down to your left hip, it kind of tilts backwards. So think of it like reclining in a chair. Okay, the top of your heart, is like what when you recline your chair, like your head pointing backwards. Okay, and therefore the apex not only points downwards towards your left hip, but it also kind of points more towards the front of your body. Okay, so those are the two basically top and bottom parts of the heart. Okay, the anterior surface is deep to the sternum and ribs. Okay, that would be what we see right here. Inferior surface, what we see right here is between the apex and the right border, resting mostly on the diaphragm. Okay, the right border or right surface, as it's labeled here, faces the right lung, extends from the inferior surface up to the base, and then the left surface or left border faces the left lung and rests or extends from the base to the apex. So those are just kind of the general gross features of the heart. We've got 3 different images kind of showing you various things here. Honestly, I don't think this image is in your labeling packet, but if it is, you can skip it. I'm not going to put this on the exam. We're going to have several other images to worry about, so I won't have you worry about this one or any others. All right, let's talk about what surrounds the heart, which is a loose fitting, inextensible, so it doesn't like to stretch, sac called the pericardium. We think all the way back to that very first lecture, and I know I keep saying this, okay? In our very first lecture, we actually have talked about the pericardium before. In fact, let me just pull that up really quickly and refresh your memories. The pericardium is one of 3 serous membranes in the body. Okay, our very, very first lecture, we talked about membranes like the thoracic cavity where your heart is and your abdominal pelvic cavity. The very next slide, we introduced these serous membranes. Okay, pericardium was one of those 3 membranes, the other being the pleural membranes that surround your lungs, peritoneum that is found in the abdominal cavity and associated with a lot of your digestive organs. This is the part of the semester where we're finally getting to talk about those things again. We're obviously talking about the pericardium now. We'll talk about the pleura in the next unit when we talk about the lungs, and same thing in the next unit when we talk about the digestive system. We'll talk about the peritoneum. Okay. Well, there's 2 parts to the pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is the outer layer and is composed of tough, inelastic, dense, irregular connective tissue. So it is very strong, and it's got the collagen, running in all sorts of different directions. Covers the entire heart, but forms attachments at the greater vessels at the base of the heart. And it functions to anchor the heart to surrounding structures and to prevent the heart from overstretching. Now, the actual part of the pericardium that we did talk about previously in that lecture that I just pulled up is the serous pericardium. The serous pericardium is a thinner, more delicate membrane forming a double layer around the heart. Okay, these layers include a parietal layer and a visceral layer. And, you know, those are what we talked about previously. Here we go, right here. The parietal layer is the outer layer. It is fused to the fibrous pericardium. Whereas the visceral layer, or what we call the epicardium, is the inner layer, and we call it the epicardium because it's actually one of the layers of the heart wall. And in other words, it has to therefore be part of the heart so it adheres tightly to the surface. Okay. What we have down here at the bottom of the page, got a frontal section, so the kind of the front of the heart's been popped off, so we can see its 3 layers, which we'll talk about here in a second. But if we zoom in at this little box, okay, we see on the very outside surrounding the entire heart is that fibrous pericardium, the very thick part of it. We see this little white line here on the inside of it is the parietal layer. And then this kind of blue area is a space called the pericardial cavity or pericardial space. And then another white line, and that white line is, where is it labeled at? Where's the line? There it is. The visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Okay. Let's talk about the space. The space, once again, is a pericardial space, pericardial cavity. It's full of a fluid called pericardial fluid, a thick serous fluid that helps provide a slippery surface for movements of the heart. So in other words, it reduces friction so that these two layers aren't rubbing and like putting holes and stuff like that in each other. Okay. Infections and inflammation can sometimes cause friction in this space, resulting in severe pain. If you've ever heard the term pericarditis before, you hear that as kind of a buzzword a lot of times watching movies and TV shows. It's kind of a common illness or condition that people within a TV show or movie have. Okay, pericarditis would be inflammation of the pericardium. Okay, if blood fills the space due to trauma, we call this pericardial tamponade, and now that would require surgery to relieve the pressure. Okay. All right, the heart wall, as I've already kind of pointed out here in the illustration, is made up of 3 layers: an epicardium, a myocardium, and then an endocardium. What we have listed here is going from superficial to deep. So the epicardium, therefore, is on the outside, which we've already talked about as part of the serous pericardium. It's the outer layer of the heart. It is made up of mesothelium, which is a form of epithelial tissue. And it also includes a delicate connective tissue imparting a smooth, slippery texture to the outermost surface of the heart. The thickest layer of the heart, and it's not even close, shown here nice and in red, is the myocardium. And if you don't remember, we've seen this prefix myo before. It is just a fancy way to say muscle, or a shorter way to say muscle. So the myocardium is the thick contractile middle layer of the heart, where you find the cardiac tissue and myocardial cells, the muscle cells of the heart. And now those muscle fibers are going to arrange themselves in kind of a cool pattern. We create what we call swirl layers that envelop the heart so that when they contract, they squeeze the chambers to empty. Okay. Looking at this illustration, we kind of see the direction in which those fibers run so that it maximizes the efficiency of the heart. Okay. Myocardium is also where you're going to find non-contracting structures known as Purkinje fibers, which we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. These are very involved with conducting and transmitting nerve impulses throughout the heart in order to cause it to contract. And unfortunately, the myocardium is the layer of tissue that can become damaged during a myocardial infarction, which is just a fancy term for what? Remember what myocardial infarction is more commonly called? Heart attack. And that can be deadly if severe enough, because that tissue will die and then the heart won't be able to pump. Finally, on the inside of the heart is what we call the endocardium. We've seen that prefix endo several times this semester. It just means inner, in this case, inner part of the heart. It is a thin, delicate layer, resembles simple squamous epithelium. Remember, simple squamous is a single layer of flat plate-like cells. It covers the inner lining of those 4 chambers, but also it covers the valves and is continuous with the inner lining of our blood vessels, where we won't call it the endocardium anymore, but instead we'll call it the endothelium. And we'll see that here next lecture when we start talking about blood vessels. As far as the images go, I do want you to identify this image here where we've got the different layers and the pericardium labeled. You don't need to worry about the 2 things here that aren't bolded: coronary blood vessels or trabeculae carneae. We're going to talk about those things later in the lecture, but they're not really something important in this picture to worry about. So we'll just skip that. All right, we have a pretty long slide here. I'm probably just going to get through the kind of first half of it, and then we'll call it a day for the lecture. Internally, the heart is composed of 4 chambers. I think it's kind of like little rooms, each of which serves a specific purpose. These chambers include 2 atria, which that form of the word atria is plural, whereas like you see here, atrium is singular. And then the 2 bottom chambers are called ventricles. Okay. The atria, or the 2 superior chambers, are called receiving chambers because they receive blood coming into the heart by way of veins. Both the right and the left atrium are described as thin-walled, low-pressure systems, and their job is just to pump the blood down to a corresponding ventricle into the bottom of the heart. Okay. Your right atrium is the chamber receiving deoxygenated blood from 3 major blood vessels, the superior and inferior vena cavas, which are what provide us with most of the what we call venous return. And then the coronary sinus, which drains blood that's actually fed the heart's wall. Between the right atrium and the left atrium is a wall known as the interatrial septum. And it's called that because inter, as we know, means between, atrial for atria. So between atria and septum is just a fancy term for wall. Okay. In the right atrium, you can find what is called the fossa ovalis, located on that interatrial septum. It is the remnant of what we call the foramen ovale. This is an opening found in the fetal heart that should normally close soon after birth. Okay. And this structure helps kind of bypass the lungs, because if you're thinking about in fetal life, the baby is not needing to breathe, and therefore the lungs aren't really needing to receive blood, because how is the baby getting its oxygen and other nutrients? Placenta and the umbilical cord, and that's all courtesy of mom. So mom's blood literally flows in and out of the baby, and that's how the nutrients and waste are going to be exchanged. And this is one of 2 very important lung bypasses that we will talk about in this lecture. Okay. Associated with the right atrium is what we call the right auricle, a small appendage accommodating a little bit of extra blood flow. It's called the right auricle. If I jump ahead to the next page, it kind of looks like a little ear flap. Okay. Remember the fancy term for your external ear, at least the cartilage part of it, is your auricle or pinna. So that's where that term comes from. When the ventricles are not contracting, blood is able to pass down through a valve into the right ventricle. We'll talk more about this in a couple slides, or maybe I think it's 2 slides ahead. We call this valve the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve, and it's just the one between the right atrium and right ventricle. Left atrium receives oxygenated blood coming back from our lungs via the pulmonary veins. Its thickness is about the same size as the right atrium. And when it pumps blood, it pumps it down through what we call the bicuspid, mitral, or left atrioventricular valve into the left ventricle. Just like the right atrium, associated with the left atrium is a left auricle to help accommodate extra blood flow. Okay. On the inside of both the right and left atrium, especially within their auricles, are what we call pectinate muscles. These are bundles of projecting muscle that helps basically just increase their force of contraction and help to force the blood down into the ventricles. Speaking of the ventricles, those are the 2 lower chambers. We call them pumping chambers because they push the blood out of the heart into a large network of blood vessels. Right ventricle is described as a pumping chamber for your pulmonary circulation, and so it is what pumps the blood to your lungs. Remember, pulmonary always refers to lungs. It forms the anterior surface of the heart, and it receives blood that's deoxygenated from the right atrium through that right AV valve or the tricuspid valve. Compared to the left, your right ventricle is a lot thinner walled, and that is because it only has to pump blood to its 2 neighbors, the right and the left lung, respectively. Okay, and therefore doesn't have to be as strong as the left ventricle. Your left ventricle is the pumping chamber for your systemic circulation using what we call the aorta. This is the blood vessel, therefore, that pumps blood to everything from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. it has to be very strong, and in order to do so, it's about 4 times thicker than the right ventricle. Okay, it pumps blood against a much higher pressure as well, so it has to be able to create a bunch of pressure. Between those two ventricles, just like between the atria, is a wall. This one is called the interventricular septum. We can see it here. It's also what we see right here. Okay, it contains part of the cardiac conduction system. On the floor of both the right and the left ventricles are little ridges called trabeculae carneae, and actually those were labeled here on the previous page. Okay, we can also see them if I zoom in at this cadaver picture. Okay, notice that it's not just nice and smooth, but there are these little ridges. Those are going to help, just kind of like the pectinate muscles, to increase the pressure and the ejection of blood. So it helps with blood propulsion. And we, like I said, find them in both ventricles. All right, I'm going to stop right here. We're going to start with this part on Thursday after we finish the exam, and we'll just continue on from there. Now, before I set you free, I want